Let's talk about Made in Canada and how Canada is not the USA. A lot of American collectors that are dedicated collectors believe that Canada walked the same path as the USA. We did not. Made in Canada was actually a very early 1900s ideal, and it was a battle cry to the United States. There is a deep, dark secret down in the United States where probably upwards to 90% or more of the products made in the US, and that goes for everything from freaking chairs to clothes to hollowware to stoves, were actually made in prisons. And Made in Canada came out in the very early 1900s as almost a battle cry to the United States prison made goods. What was happening in 1896 is that the US went through a recession. And through all of the tariffs and whatnot, they kind of shot themselves in the bum. So what we see is articles, and I'll have to pull those out, of, you'll see a Canadian salesman on trains meeting American salesmen. And a lot of the stuff they were dumping into the US was American prison made iron. And a lot of it was hollowware. So unfortunately, we're stuck in a rut where a lot of the unmarked iron that we see in Canada, we don't even know if it's American or Canadian, let alone be able to trace it to a manufacturer. So I tend to spend a fair amount of time on American groups looking for iron that's possibly made in Canada and possibly made in the United States. So unfortunately, when you have an unmarked piece of iron that's either gate marked or goes back to say 1860s through 1900s, it may never be identified as either American or Canadian, let alone being identified as a manufacturer. When we look at here, um, a lot of Canadian collectors still believe that the Made in Canada is a US thing and it was pushed by the United States. It wasn't. So I kind of like the idea when I talk to collectors of anything in Canada, they believe that when they see Made in Canada, it's actually post 1960. It may not be. It may be, but it may not be. So we go back to 1902, and this is the original Made in Canada logo, and it was never a forced thing. It was purely voluntary, but you'll see quite a few pieces of Canadian made goods made in Canada by Canadian labor. And this again goes back to 1902. I think it was actually started on Canadian toys. And you'll see the maple leaf made in Canada. So the interesting part of it, I found a article quite a while back, and a lot of Americans had no idea about this. And it's regarding the hollowware pool. And you'll see quite a bit. And I mean, when you think about how much the hollowware and stoves were made in the free market by companies like Griswold and Favorite and everything else outside of prisons, it'll blow your mind at how much hollowware was actually made in the United States. And this is a fascination to me. So when we look at, I mean, Columbus State Penitentiary was one of the big centers in the United States for hollowware and stove manufacture, and quite a bit more. But you'll see that, like, through the 1850s through to 1880s, a lot of the free market was actually killed. A lot of the free market foundries were actually killed by prison-made hollowware and stoves. They just couldn't compete. When you've got a whole fleet of prison labor, how do you compete with the cheap wages and to try to sell a product when they can sell it a lot cheaper? And it was to the point that it almost seemed like they just didn't care about the free market. They were doing their thing. They wanted to sell what they had. And I'm sure a lot of these prison wardens got pretty rich out of the cheap labor that they had under them. In 1896, we start seeing states enacting legislation limiting or fully restricting or outright banning the use of foundries in prisons. You'll see companies like Sperry in New York. They got into bed with Sing Sing prison, and it actually destroyed them because once you got into bed with a prison, they pretty much owned you. They owned your patterns. You signed a contract, and that was it. So, was it D. Sperry? They actually went under. They were actually destroyed by getting in bed with prison-made labor. So there is I'll put this actual link in the description and some more links you can read. But in the 1890s, there was an article that came out in one of, I think it was Metal Worker. and they actually discovered the deep dark secret of all this prison-made iron that was actually dumped into Canada, and stoves and everything else. The Knights of Labor, which I mentioned in the favorite stove and range history video, they actually were probably top of getting this stuff changed. And apparently, I recall from one article, they hadn't put a mark on prison-made goods, but I don't know what it is. So it's quite an interesting history. I'll leave a few links in the description that you can read and go from there. But yeah, when you look at Made in Canada, don't assume that it's mid or 1960 and later. You'll see GSW pieces that are actually from the 30s that are marked Made in Canada. You'll see Finlay pieces from earlier that are actually marked Made in Canada. You'll see a lot of toys and a lot of stoves that are actually marked Canada. And you'll see boxes and stuff like that, like shipping crates that are actually made in Canada by Canadian labor. So again, the Made in Canada, it wasn't a requirement. It was more so of a volunteer thing, and a lot of companies actually adopted it. So it was actually made in Canada by Canadian labor. So whenever you see a piece in a antique mall or whatever have you, and you see made in Canada, don't just assume that it was 1960. Look into it a little more.